the more difficult it is for the caregiver to recognize the sacrifices that they're making, the sacredness of this, to see reflected in the eyes of others what a great job they're doing, you know, and also to see recognized in the face of others why actually very subtle moments that rarely people talk about are causing more grief sometimes actually than when a person dies. We're going to speak more about that. Now let's speak for a minute about the very specific forms of grief for caregivers, referred to sometimes as ambiguous loss and also anticipatory loss. What does that mean? First, it means that unlike other types of loss, caregivers experience an extended period of grief before their loved one dies. The average caregiver with this illness will spend about 6 to 8 years of caregiving. Now, if we're not prepared for this journey ahead at the beginning, sometimes what can happen is this can lead to what they refer to as chronic sorrow or complicated forms of grief after the loved one dies. The interesting thing about this chronic sorrow or anticipatory grief is that caregivers rarely recognize it as such. This is very important. They don't really realize that they're actively grieving as they go. Because for most of us, we assume that grief is just something that we do after someone dies, right? One of the most difficult things about dementia, in its variety of forms, is that it's often referred to as a living loss. So losses which occur more incrementally as it progresses, and losses that are related to the illness and not simply the death, okay? Now, the thing about this is that for those of us who are living and loving someone with dementia, we have to grieve these losses as we go. And the problem is that if we don't know that these are there to grieve, we end up in the territory of disenfranchised grief. Now, because we are getting so good at understanding all these nuances and different types of grief, we know that disenfranchised grief is that grief that isn't recognized by society and therefore not recognized by us. So the caregiver and the person being cared for, the sufferer, can kind of drift into this extended, unrecognized state of grief, isolated from the community. Because there's no acknowledgement, it's harder for the caregiver, more to the point though, it's harder for the caregiver to make sense of grief that they're not acknowledging. And it accumulates. That's the thing I really want us to understand. It sort of builds up. There's layers of it that aren't processed. The more and more this accumulated grief is unrecognized, the more difficult it is to make meaning from it, right? So the more difficult it is for the caregiver to recognize the sacrifices that they're making, the sacredness of this, to see reflected in the eyes of others what a great job they're doing, you know, and also to see recognized in the face of others why actually very subtle moments that rarely people talk about are causing more grief sometimes actually than when a person dies. We're going to speak more about that. The good news is that we can enfranchise people. We can acknowledge their ongoing grief, support them in it as they go, not just when a loved one dies, and actually give them tools for different stages. Now, if we can do this right there, we're making a big difference to the situation. If we can be brave and lean into this with a little bit of forward planning, we can significantly improve the quality of life for both the individual who is diagnosed and also the person or people who are going to be taking responsibility for their care.